Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Chucky Season 2, Episode 4. So, we immediately have to state that probably a lot of people are going to leave or probably have left disappointed in this episode. Because, of course, this episode is to focus on the Tiffany Nika story for the whole thing. We do have Chucky who intros and outros and does the kind of the talk show fourth wall break thing. Um, and so I liked that this episode is to go on and be a murder mystery as well as kind of tying in certain celebrities, like of course Liv Morgan, that I was like, oh my god, Liv Morgan, yeah. Like, I follow WWE. Like, I know that she recently finally became women's champ and was to also be on like Up Up Down Down, where she had the one chip challenge with Xavier Woods. Recently seeing that on the YouTube channel. I was excited about that, because that was cool. And then I went on and I was to see a bunch of other kind of celebrities that I'm like, oh yeah, like I know, Joe Pantoliano. Sorry, I know I was going to butcher that name. But I know him from like U.S. Marshals, and I know him from like Daredevil, the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie. And I also know Gina Gershon from her recently being in like Eminently the Criminal, or also like Showgirls at some point, because everybody is to at some point have possibly seen that film because it's there. And I do know, I think at one point that Tina was with Tilly in one movie also. So from what I remember, anyways, Sun Strack, I guess, is a reality star from Real Housewives. I get it. There's a lot of an attempt at trying to get something trending going on here. I appreciate the temp show, but so this is to be this goofy murder mystery that is to really focus on the Nika Tiffany storyline, and we are to finally get closure of Glenda and Glenn. For those of you who hadn't gone on and seen either Bride of Chucky or Seed of Chucky, there is going to be some references to those movies in this episode. So if you haven't gone on and seen those movies, you might not know who these characters are, because the scene that they reference in this episode is to be tied to Seed of Chucky, and the girl that ends up arriving, that ends up getting a lighter hairspray treatment, is to be Joan. So I was like, okay, all right, so that's where that's from. When going into this episode, so with that said, come to find out, we realize that somebody is alive after all, who we thought was dead. So that we have people be guessing who that could be. We won't find that out to the tail end of this step. So with that said, that is probably a very thin teeing up, but I think there is not much else for me to go on and state beyond what I've already technically stated. And so, sadly enough, with that said, I think we're just about going into just spoiler time for this review. So, let me know how you felt about this episode, whether you were to go on and just be like, yeah, I really hated this episode, or you might have mixed feelings. In all honesty, for the grading of this episode, I knew I wasn't going to go on and highly praise and just thoroughly just overall enjoy this episode, but I had fun. I had fun. There were some goofy things in here. The whole them they license plate thing was like, oh my god, that's a movie reference, because I had seen They recently, and of course I know that there's another horror film called Them, and so I think that's why they ended up putting that in there. But then they ended up explaining the whole them they thing also in this episode. So with that said, this episode honestly was bad, but I had fun. Like, it was to just want me to possibly say that it was good, even though really it was to be this goofy, weird thing that is to probably just give a ton of people a break. So like they can kind of like give them some time off and then have them come back into the other episodes a lot more fresh. But then also just the guest stars in this episode was just, even though it was so. With that said, let's go on into just the double five time territory as we usually do, because it's about that time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about that time you spoil this episode. So we go into the beginning of this, and Chucky is to intro the show with him going on and complaining through this earpiece that he wants certain nuts and not walnuts. For me, I'm a cashew guy or a pistachio. Let me know in the comments below what is your favorite nut. And you can also make jokingly references to other kinds of nuts if you know what I mean. I'm a big nut girl. I'm a big nut guy. Okay. Anyways, so going into this episode, we have Chucky, who is like, oh yeah, like I didn't realize you were there kind of thing. And so Chucky is to give us a thing that we've been kind of wanting for a number of episodes to figure out how exactly Belle is going to be put into this show. Wedding Belle, the doll from episodes before. How is she going to get placed and get used in this show? And so we have Chucky that is like, well, luckily we have Wedding Belle right here. And so all of a sudden Belle is to be standing there just like, and so Chucky's like, well, hey Belle, like how are things? Like how do you think that you're gonna be used in this show? And Belle's just like, and then Chucky's like, well, okay, well, like, there is Belle for you. So we have Chucky that is to introduce the show and is to, of course, give us this kind of like a murder mystery of this episode. So we are to have everything that is to go on and tie us into either the movies or the shows. And so we have one point where Glenn is to go on and state that he is to have different personalities, and come to find out the way of which the people are to explain it, that there were to have been two different kids that Tiffany did get birth to, but then somehow, like, Glenn was to have like two personalities within inside of him that kind of switched off at certain points. So again, this is a Bride of Chucky, Seed of Chucky kind of reference here that they kind of expanded upon. So anyways, let's go on to this. So we have Tiffany that is going on and wiping the blood, like, oh yeah, I gotta go on and like I know the twins are coming. So all of a sudden we have Glenn and Glenda that arrive, and so they're going on and of course asking about the blood, and Tiffany's just like, well, hey, I'm doing something for my Instagram, I just cleaned it up. And because she wanted to kind of deliver her fan something violent for her gram, and she's having her phone up like, hey, yeah. So we, funny enough, I saw on Jennifer Tilly's social media, she ended up having this picture about these fake pair of knockers that are just kind of left on the side of the road somewhere. And Tiffany ends making the joke about like, well, hey, like somebody killed Jennifer Tilly, and like had a good joke about it. So yeah, so I was like surprisingly just so happened to like find on some thing somewhere where somebody shared about Jennifer and having that little joke at her own expense. Also, like, let's say it, like, freaking Jennifer Tilly looks great in this episode. She does. So, but let's get into this. So, we go into this episode, and so Tiffany is trying to clean up the blood, and it's realizing that both Glenn and Glenda want to go on and take off their coats. Because of the detective being dead in the coat room, we have Tiffany who grabs their coats and tosses them in there instead. And so we go on to have Tiffany who's like, well, hey, let's catch up. Like, how has it been with you two? And so we come to find out that both Glenn and Glenda are all both dating the same guy, a guy named Paul. Paul. So, cause it's funny enough how, like, they had Tiffany, like, say it's like, well, hey, you're dating a guy named Paul and you're dating a guy named Paul. Like, isn't that weird? And they're like, oh no, we're dating the same person. It's like, oh, okay. So we go on to have Glenn that is to leave because he wants to go on and go to the bathroom. Or, I'm sorry, Glenn wants to go on and go to the bathroom. I'm like, because the license plate ends up stating they, them, and so really we're gonna have to go and really be trying to figure out how we can kind of mention these characters because they themselves even have to, like, showcase in this episode how they want to be, like, said for this episode, which is great. So we have Glenn that leaves, and so Tiffany and Glenda are starting to talk, and we have Glenda state that she's been having this dream lately about her going on and killing somebody with this lighter and this hairspray, and that person ends up being Joan. And that, of course, is a reference to the Seed of Chucky film, where we go on and had at one point where Glenda is to take control of things and is to find Joan in Jennifer's house, goes on and is to put her on fire, and it seems that Joan ends up dying by kind of falling to her death in that part of Seed of Chucky. So we had Glenda that is asking Tiffany, well, like, what does this mean? And Tiffany's like, well, I don't know, like, it's a dream. Like, we also had Glenda that was stating that there had been somebody who had called her a doo-doo head, let's say for censor purposes, so we don't actually say head. And I could just say head and it would probably work, right? Doo-doo head! Doo-doo head sounds funny. So we go on and have Glenda that is asking about this, how, like, this person was saying doo-doo head, but in a very supporting manner, as if trying to motivate her, and, or motivating Glenda, my bad. So Tiffany, of course, was to go on and state, well, like, it's a dream, but hey, where's Glenn? So Tiffany goes off to realize that Glenn is going on to try and open this door that obviously Nika is in. And so we go on and we have Glenn who's opening this door, trying to get into it. And so we have Tiffany who is bringing a man along called Jeeves, who is to be kind of like the security for tonight, as well as being a technically butler, because if you have a name like Jeeves, that would probably be a butler's name. We find out the real guy's name, but anyways. So, and then Tiffany makes a joke about Glenn wanting to like take her shoes or whichever, and so Glenn ends up asking why the door is locked, so on and so forth. So Tiffany and Glenn make their way back downstairs, and so Tiffany is mentioning how she doesn't like surprises, and then boom, she ends up getting surprised by this birthday celebration that is meant for both Glenn and Glenda. And because, of course, Glenn and Glenda, this is their birthday party, and we have, of course, uh, Gina Gershon, we have Joe Pantoliano, uh, and Sutton Strack here, who are all playing themselves. So we also have Meg Tilly here, who is also, of course, uh, Jennifer's sister. And so we go on and have Meg, who's like, well, yeah, I know it's been so long since we talked to one another, ever since that you went on and did that Chucky movie. Like, it seems like we haven't really talked, blah, blah, blah. So, Tiffany's just like, well, yeah, like, all right, blah, 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 blah. So, we go on and even have Meg, who is mentioning how she had gotten I think, like an Oscar nod before, like, Tiffany did, and so on and so forth. So, we go into this film, or go into this episode, I mean, and so Tiffany is realizing she is having a security notification. And so Tiffany is realizing that, like, oh no, Nika could get out here. And so what Tiffany ends up going on and doing is running off to see, like, well, hey, where is Jeeves? Because Jeeves, of course, has gone on and handed out all of these people this birthday cake, and we end up getting both Glenn and Glenda, who these people are going on and stating the way of which that Glenn and Glenda should be pronounced, and Glenn and Glenda should be pronounced as they, them, or sib kids, not nieces and nephews, and so on and so forth. So Jeeves was just like, well, hey, why can't I just, and like Tiffany just kind of carts him off back to the room, and we of course have Jeeves that doesn't know who he's guarding. So, but Tiffany goes back into the party and then is to realize that there is a security problem, so she runs off to find Jeeves dead, and in the bottle is to have been cyanide. And I guess Jeeves has wanted to go on and drink a bottle of champagne, and he ends up dying from it. So, come to find out, the doors of this room are now open, and Tiffany is now like, oh my god, like Nika had gotten out, or maybe even Chucky had gotten out. So, we now have everybody kind of walking up to just be like, well, hey, what is Tiffany doing? And everybody's to realize that Jeeves is now dead. So we go on to, of course, have Tiffany, who's to play it off as like, oh yeah, this is a murder mystery. Hey, isn't this great? Like, I'm going to be the detective, and we're going to go on and question everybody to figure out who the murderer is. And they're just like, okay, yeah. Like, we had Gina that goes on and states that she loves murder mysteries, and so it's like, yeah, like, okay, this is how it's all going to work out. So Tiffany ends up taking everybody to this room, and we have so many, like, transitional things in this episode that is to come off very much like Clue, if you guys remember Clue, where they would say, like, and this is how the story really happened, and, like, or they would be like, well, like, that's not the real ending, but what is it? Like, that would be kind of like how Clue would do its, like, weird, goofy things, to just try to, like, transition to tell you, like, where the movie is going. So, we have Tiffany that is going on and, like, trying to state what she's trying to do here, but then, like, certain people start to take over, as, like, Gina is starting to do all of this in a like a traditional like old-fashioned murder mystery detective like accent, and so she does all these accents, and everybody's like, wow, like Gina sounds really great, and like praising her and so on and so forth. So Tina's like, well, no, 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 like I'm taking over here because I'm the detective. And so Tiffany starts going on and starts to question people, but really like she is to try to even individually start to take people into other rooms where it seems that they are trying to get a little bit of intimate with Tiffany. As we go on and have Tiffany, who is taking Gina in a separate room, where all of a sudden Gina is to do a little finger hockey up the dress of Tiffany, as we find out that it seems that both of these two are to be romantically entangled. And so we then go on and have Tiffany not being able to get any answers from Gina, as of course she's to not really find her being the killer. So then Joe comes into the room and is to want to get a blow from Tiffany. A little bit of blowy, if you know what I mean. Because I like to make the joke about a BJ being just a blowy. To me, it's funny. So Tiffany goes on and talks to Joe, and of course, knowing this guy from U.S. Marshals and Daredevil, cool. Anyways, so Tiffany is talking to Joe, and Joe is wanting to just toss his pants down, having Tiffany just give him a little job, if you know what I mean. And Tiffany slides from between his legs and runs off, realizing that Joe is to also not be the killer because he doesn't care. Oh, Joe is also in Memento. Oddly enough. Anyways, so we obviously can figure out that Sutton is not the character, as she is to be this reality star and so on and so forth. So, anyways, let's maneuver on here to figure out who could be the only culprits left. So, we go on to find out that while Tiffany is to be gone, we realize that both Glenn and Glenda both had tried to help out Nika. Because 3 months ago, we are to find that when Nika and Glenn were to visit, and Tiffany at some point had been watching Liar Liar and had mentioned how Jim Carrey had thought that Tiffany was a really good actress, even better than some others, and then she goes on and passes out drunk. As we had Glenn and Glenda when they re-meet up with Tiffany. Currently, were to state about like how like she's getting wild with alcohol and all kinds of other things, and so trying to be like the uh, the kids to the parent. So we go on to then, of course, have Glenn and Glenda in the flashback 3 months ago, going on and getting earrings to unlock this door to then find Nika, who is gagged in this room. And so Nika goes on and explains her situation to the two girls, as we also are to find that Glenda is to have a knife with her so she could get into this room. So all of a sudden, we accidentally have Glenda, who is to stab herself with this knife, and that's when Nika all of a sudden changes into Chucky. And it's kind of funny to have both Nika and Chucky and both Glenn and Glenda all in the same scene, because we have like people who had gone on doll form and changed from two different personalities to now have Nika slash Chucky, who is changing into two different personalities. Like, I guess it's the perfect way to go for this episode. So all of a sudden we now have Glenda, who is to decide that she is going to just leave or we have Glenn, who has decided to leave while Glenda is alone with now Chucky. So I think maybe Glenda had gone on to get like band-aids or something. So, anyways, we have Glenda talking to Chucky, and Chucky is to have called her a doo-doo head, and is to say, it's like, well, hey, you know, I always was to tell you that in a very supporting manner. And so, like, we then have Glenda, who is remembering everything, and that's why she's having those dreams that she ends up talking to Tiffany about, putting it all full circle. So now that both Glenn and Glenda both know that Nika slash Chucky is to be in that room, they go on and rescue her and are, of course, giving us the Psycho reference when we, of course, have Nika who's in this very white window and her shadow is shown, and then they kind of haul her away. And it's like, oh, like Psycho reference. So that's great. So we go on, and like the they them thing that was on the license plate, but also was to be said about Glenn and Glenda. They and Them is actually both horror films. Them, I think, is to be like a really old horror film. They, I think, was remade, and I went on and saw They uh, recently. So, like, cool, they had a horror reference as well as Psycho in this episode also. So we we take it here to uh have Tiffany trying to find Nika, and we end up instead having at some point where Tiffany is to find Joe in the elevator and he's dead. So we're going to go on and have to explain how Joe is dead, because again, we are to have us find this body when both Glenda and both Nika are going into the elevator. Joe's body's already there, and that's when, of course, Nika switches into Chucky and is to ask where his arms are, where his mechanical arms are. We also had a moment where Nika was to mention about her pinky finger itching, and she ends up talking about this with Glenn, and so they end up kind of talking about like phantom limbs and stuff like that, and I think that's when Glenn is to state like, well, yeah, there's sometimes where I feel that same way too, that I'm kind of feeling something that I'm not quite sure about. So we we go on to have now Nika with these metal arms, which is to then have uh, Tiffany be confronted by Nika to try and shoot her. So we end up having everybody coming out to this one room. Gina, uh, Sutton, whoever is still alive, uh, both both Glenn and Glenda. So Chucky is to now want to go on and shoot Tiffany, and he's kind of wondering if he should shoot her in the head or in the heart. And Tiffany ends up stating that it's like, well, you already like killed my heart, and so he's like, well, the head then. So we have, of course, Chucky that ends up firing upon Tiffany to realize there is no bullets in this gun. So we then have Tiffany that slaps Chucky in the face to make now Chucky turn back into Nika. So Nika is to take her wheelchair and spin like the wind to get the heck out of there, to go on and try to get out of this place. So we oddly enough have a ride that has this ramp that is going on and picking up luckily Nika here, and we have both Glenn and Glenda who are kind of talking about whether or not they're going to leave with Nika, and it seems that Glenda is going to leave with Nika, and Glenn is just like, no, I think I need to stay here with Mom. So Tiffany is realizing that there is a security breach, that the gate is open, and so Tiffany is screaming for Nika, and she, of course, is looking at her phone with the app that is stating that there's a security breach, the gate needs to be closed, and so Tiffany tries to close the gate and is to still be on her phone screaming. We end up seeing Tiffany's image on the side of this kind of TV, like by this gate. So we go on to have Nika that just barely escapes the gate before it closes, and Glenda ends up kind of jumping the massive fence here, like the concrete fencing. So we come to find out that that Nika is to be in the vehicle with none other than Kyle, who is driving this vehicle. And so Kyle is to turn to Nika and say, it's like, well, hey, like, you're Nika, and it's nice to finally meet you. And so Nika is looking at Kyle. It's like, okay, let's get out of here. Glenda is to kind of push up the ramp to kind of get into the car and leave, so that way they can get the heck out of there. And so we end up having Tiffany still screaming about how Nika had left, so on and so forth. So with that said, that ends up wrapping up the story of this episode, but there's also still things to cover. So Chucky ends up coming back, doing the outro of this episode, and he ends up needing to do it with a special guest star, who of course is WWE's Liv Morgan. Yay! So we go on here to then have Chucky needing to do some explaining. And so how, of course, Jeeves was to get killed off is none other than Glenda was to have the cyanide in the champagne, because I guess Glenda is to have a spare thing of cyanide for any case that would occur. And how is it that Joe died if Glenn and Glenda did not go on and kill this person? So come to find out, we of course had Gina, who had saw that Joe was in a room with his pants down, and so Gina had gotten very jealous of Joe and had whipped out this gun and fired bullets into him. And so we had seen kind of Joe fall over in this bed, dead. I guess Gina had hauled Joe's body into this elevator, and so that's when we end up seeing him later on. So that kind of ties up loose ends for this episode. But now the last loose end is just be like, okay, why is Liv Morgan here on this show? Besides her, of course, kind of just like, yeah, like this is like the talking doll head. Because talking dead, talking doll head, might as well bizarrely work that in. So we have Liv Morgan, who is to just be like, well, okay, like there's a whole video stating that Liv Morgan had talked about this episode through some social media thing somewhere, stating that all she's ever wanted to do is be killed by Chucky, without, I guess, it being tied to some storyline or tied to whatever. Like, Liv is always game to just, like, be in any part of this. And so Chucky's like, well, I'm happy to oblige. So immediately Chucky is to whip out this kitchen knife and go to town on Liv Morgan, killing her, to where, of course, we're probably now never going to be able to see her on WWE television, because Liv Morgan is now dead. Maybe she'll come back as a dead character. Wouldn't that be funny for WWE television? Like, Liv is now a zombie. No. But wouldn't that be fun to, like, we're really just, like, still gonna sell that Liv Morgan had died. from a Chucky show, like to try to like retroactively just commercialize it and whatever, and do a whole storyline in WWE of what happened and so on and so forth. So yeah, so really Chucky is just a setup to everybody. It's like, well, hey, like I get this episode is the way it is, and like he's effing everybody, and he's just saying the F word a lot so he can kind of get his F's in. And so Chucky goes on and states the following week he'll be back to kill off all those kids. So we really just have to realize that this episode was probably just give a lot of people some time off, a break, uh, probably for holidays or for whatever, for anybody who's to probably just also just want a week off because uh, this show for whatever reason. So with that said, we go on and have just Chucky and the show. And I think with that said, I think I'm going to go on and just end this review. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about this episode. Seed of Chucky references and all. So yeah, so with that said, I think I'm going to go on and just get out of here. Thank you for going on and listening to me talk about this episode. Thank you for going on and hearing me out. Without a doubt, it's great to have a number of people that are all checking out this review. So thank you. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.